The evening sky turned a deep orange as Judge Wilson drove home from the courthouse. It had been one of those days where every case felt heavier than usual. 5 back-to-back hearings about families falling apart, young people making mistakes that would follow them for years, and victims seeking justice that sometimes the law couldn't fully provide. All he wanted now was a quiet dinner and maybe to catch the basketball game on TV. His dark blue Mercedes glided smoothly along the tree-lined streets of Oak Ridge, the neighborhood he called home for nearly 12 years. The car was just 3 weeks old, still smelling of fresh leather. After 15 years on the bench, he'd finally rewarded himself with something nice. His wife had teased him for weeks about finally acting like a judge instead of driving his old reliable sedan into the ground. Judge Wilson adjusted his rearview mirror and noticed headlights following closely behind him. He tapped his brakes gently, thinking perhaps he was going too slow for the driver behind. The headlights suddenly transformed into flashing red and blue lights. "What in the world?" he muttered, checking his speedometer. He was going exactly 2 miles under the limit. Always careful, always following rules. A habit from childhood his grandfather had drilled into him. "A black man never has room for mistakes," his grandfather would say. Judge Wilson signaled and pulled over to the curb, positioning his car carefully. His judicial robe was still on. He'd been in such a hurry to get home he hadn't changed. He took a deep breath, then placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be clearly seen. Another lesson from his grandfather. Through his side mirror, he watched a police officer approach. Tall, stiff-backed, with a hand resting near his gun. The officer's face seemed set like concrete before he even reached the window. Judge Wilson pressed the button to lower his window. "Good evening, officer," he said politely, maintaining eye contact but keeping his expression neutral. The officer, whose nameplate read Officer Redding, didn't return the greeting. Instead, his eyes narrowed as he scanned the car's interior, then the judge's face, then back to the luxury car. "License and registration," Officer Redding demanded, his voice carrying an edge that made Judge Wilson's stomach tighten. "May I ask why I've been pulled over?" the judge asked calmly. "I don't believe I was speeding or violating any traffic laws." The officer's jaw clenched visibly. "This vehicle matches the description of one that was reported stolen about an hour ago." Judge Wilson blinked in surprise. "There must be some mistake. I've owned this car for 3 weeks. I'm happy to show you my registration and proof of purchase." "Step out of the vehicle," Officer Redding ordered, ignoring the explanation. His hand moved closer to his weapon. "Officer, I'm going to reach slowly for my registration in the glove compartment, and my wallet with my license is in my inside pocket," Judge Wilson explained carefully. "I'd be happy to show you." "I said step out of the vehicle now," Officer Redding interrupted, his voice rising. "Keep your hands where I can see them." Neighbors were beginning to notice. Across the street, a woman walking her dog had stopped to watch. 2 houses down, an older man stepped onto his porch, squinting to see what was happening. Judge Wilson felt a familiar heaviness settle over him, a feeling he thought his position might have finally sheltered him from. 15 years on the bench, thousands of cases presided over, a respected member of the community, and still, this. "I'm a superior court judge," he said quietly. "Judge Wilson, if you check my ID." "And I'm the Tooth Fairy," Officer Redding scoffed. "A judge driving a brand new Mercedes? Sure. Exit the vehicle now, or I'll have to remove you myself." As Judge Wilson carefully opened his door, he caught sight of himself in the side mirror, still in his black judicial robes, about to be made to stand on the street like a criminal in his own neighborhood in front of his neighbors. A second police car pulled up behind Officer Redding's cruiser, its lights also flashing. What should have been a 5-minute misunderstanding was quickly becoming something much worse. "This is going to be a long night," Judge Wilson thought as he slowly stepped out onto the pavement, the weight of his robes suddenly feeling much heavier than usual. Judge Wilson stood on the street beside his Mercedes, the evening breeze causing his judicial robes to flutter slightly. The neighborhood had grown unnervingly quiet except for the rhythmic flash of blue and red lights painting everything in alternating colors. More neighbors had emerged from their homes, watching from a distance with concerned expressions. "Place your hands on the hood of the vehicle," Officer Redding commanded, his voice carrying down the peaceful suburban street. "Officer, this is completely unnecessary," Judge Wilson replied, keeping his voice steady despite his rising frustration. "If you just check my identification." "Hands on the hood," Redding repeated, louder this time. "Do it now." The second officer who had arrived, a younger man with a buzz cut, stood a few feet back, hand resting on his belt. He looked uncertain but remained silent as his colleague took charge. Judge Wilson slowly placed his hands on the warm hood of his car. 15 years of commanding respect in his courtroom, and now he was being treated like a common criminal on his own street. The irony wasn't lost on him. How many times had he instructed defendants to respect police authority, to comply first and contest later? "Spread your legs," Officer Redding ordered, moving closer. "My wallet is in my inside pocket," Judge Wilson said calmly. "My judicial ID is there as well. My bar card too. The car registration is in the glove compartment." Redding ignored him and began patting him down with quick, rough movements. "Pretty fancy costume you've got on. Where'd you get the judge outfit?" "Halloween store." The younger officer shifted uncomfortably but remained silent. From across the street, a neighbor called out, "Hey, that's Judge Wilson. He lives here." It was Mrs. Chen from 3 doors down. She had brought cookies when Judge Wilson and his family first moved in. Her son had interned at the courthouse last summer. Officer Redding glanced at her, then back at Judge Wilson with narrowed eyes. "Ma'am, please stay back. This is police business." "But he really is a judge," Mrs. Chen insisted. Redding pulled the wallet from Judge Wilson's pocket. He flipped it open, glancing at the driver's license, then at the judicial identification card. His expression didn't change. "Anyone can get fake IDs these days," he muttered, though there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "And that still doesn't explain how someone like you is driving a brand new Mercedes worth more than I make in a year." "Someone like me?" Judge Wilson repeated quietly. "What exactly do you mean by that, officer?" Before Redding could respond, a third police car pulled up. Judge Wilson recognized the officer who stepped out, Officer Rivera. He had testified in Judge Wilson's courtroom just last month in a domestic violence case. "Judge Wilson." Officer Rivera called out, looking confused as he approached. "What's going on here?" "You know this man?" Redding asked, his shoulders tensing. "Of course I do. That's Judge Wilson from Superior Court," Rivera replied, bewilderment clear in his voice. "I was just in his courtroom 3 weeks ago." The atmosphere shifted immediately. The younger officer took a small step back. Redding's face flushed, but he maintained his stance. "He was reported driving a stolen vehicle," Redding said stiffly. "I'm just following protocol." "My car wasn't stolen, Officer Redding," Judge Wilson said, still keeping his hands on the hood. "I bought it 3 weeks ago. The paperwork is in the glove compartment, as I've mentioned several times." Officer Rivera looked between them, then at the gathering crowd of neighbors. "Maybe we should verify the registration, just to be sure." Redding hesitated, then gave a curt nod. "Fine, I'll check the glove box." As Redding leaned into the car, Judge Wilson straightened up, adjusting his robes. The neighbors were no longer pretending not to watch. Some had their phones out, recording the scene. Judge Wilson could already imagine the headlines: "Black judge mistaken for car thief in his own neighborhood." Officer Rivera approached him quietly. "I'm sorry about this, Your Honor," he whispered. "There was no stolen vehicle report for a Mercedes today, not in this area." Judge Wilson looked at him sharply. "What are you saying?" Before Rivera could answer, Redding emerged from the car with the registration paperwork and proof of purchase. He stared at the documents for a long moment, then at Judge Wilson. There was no apology in his eyes, only frustration at being proven wrong. "Seems to be in order," he said flatly. "You're free to go." But Judge Wilson knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The damage was done, to his dignity, to his sense of security in his own neighborhood, to his children's belief that their father's position protected him from such treatment. "No," Judge Wilson said quietly. "I don't think this is over at all." Back inside his Mercedes, Judge Wilson sat motionless, hands gripping the steering wheel. The police cars were still there, lights flashing, officers huddled in discussion. His neighbors stood in small clusters on their lawns, some pretending not to stare, others openly watching. A few were still holding their phones up, recording everything. He should drive away. Just start the car and go home. His house was only 3 blocks from here. His wife would be wondering where he was. Dinner would be getting cold. But he couldn't move. 15 years on the bench, sentencing people to jail time, lecturing them about respecting the law, and here he was, treated like a criminal for driving his own car in his own neighborhood. All because Officer Redding took one look at him and decided a black man in an expensive car must be a thief. A knock on his window startled him. It was Officer Rivera. Judge Wilson lowered the window halfway. "Your Honor, I want to apologize for what happened here tonight," Rivera said, looking genuinely embarrassed. This wasn't right." "No, it wasn't," Judge Wilson agreed, his voice tight. "There was no stolen vehicle report for a Mercedes, was there?" Rivera looked down, then shook his head. "No, sir." "So Officer Redding lied?" I can't speak to that, Your Honor." Judge Wilson nodded slowly. "No, I suppose you can't, but I can, and I will." He started the engine. From the corner of his eye, he could see Officer Redding watching him, still standing beside his patrol car. No apology, not even an acknowledgement of his mistake. "I'll need to file a report about this," Judge Wilson told Rivera. "I'd appreciate it if you'd be honest about what you saw here tonight." Rivera hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, sir." Judge Wilson drove the 3 blocks home in silence, the weight of what had just happened settling deeper with each passing second. As he pulled into his driveway, he noticed his hands were shaking. The front door opened before he could even get out of the car. His wife stood there, worry etched across her face. Behind her, their 2 teenage children peered out. "You're late," she said, then noticed his expression. What happened? He couldn't answer right away. How did he explain to his children that their father, a Superior Court judge respected throughout the county, had been treated like a common criminal? That the position he'd worked so hard to achieve meant nothing the moment a certain type of officer saw his skin color. Inside, he sat heavily at the kitchen table, still wearing his judicial robe. "Dad?" his son asked, concern in his young voice. "What's wrong?" Judge Wilson looked at his family, his wife standing by the stove, dinner waiting, his daughter with her textbooks spread across the other end of the table, his son just back from basketball practice. Their safe, comfortable world had just developed a crack he wasn't sure he could repair. "I was pulled over," he began slowly. 3 blocks from here." He told them everything. The false claim about a stolen car, being made to stand in the street, the search, the disrespect, the neighbors watching, the phones recording. His wife's face hardened with each word. She'd warned him about buying the Mercedes. Not because they couldn't afford it, but because she just knew, something like this might happen. "What are you going to do?" she asked when he finished. His son's eyes were wide, angry. "They can't do that to you. You're a judge." "Apparently, that doesn't matter to some people," his daughter said quietly. She was 17, already too aware of how the world worked. Judge Wilson's phone buzzed with an incoming text. It was from his colleague, Judge Patel. "Are you okay? There's a video going around." He looked up at his family. "It's already online." His wife sat down beside him and took his hand. "So what now?" The question hung in the air between them. What now, indeed? He could file a complaint that would likely go nowhere. He could try to have the video taken down, but that was impossible these days. He could do nothing and hope people forgot about it. Or he could use his position, his authority, his first-hand experience to actually change something. "Now," Judge Wilson said slowly, "I think it's time for some justice." Judge Wilson barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Officer Redding's face, heard the command to put his hands on the hood, felt the eyes of his neighbors watching. By morning, the video had spread far beyond his small circle of colleagues. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing with notifications. "Have you seen the news?" his wife asked, placing a cup of coffee in front of him. She turned up the volume on the kitchen TV. There it was. Grainy cell phone footage showing him in his judicial robes, hands on the hood of his Mercedes while being searched. The headline below read, "Judge mistaken for car thief in own neighborhood." His son paused halfway through his breakfast. "Dad, you're famous now." "Not the kind of famous I ever wanted to be," Judge Wilson replied, rubbing his temples. His daughter looked up from her phone. "It's everywhere." People are really angry about it. The doorbell rang. Through the window, Judge Wilson could see 2 news vans parked across the street. "Don't answer it," he told his wife, who was already moving toward the door. His phone rang. It was Chief Justice Reynolds, his boss at the courthouse. "Wilson, I've just seen the footage," Reynolds said without preamble. "This is unacceptable. Are you all right?" "As well as can be expected," Judge Wilson replied. "The police chief called me this morning. He's requesting a meeting with both of us. How soon can you come in?" An hour later, Judge Wilson sat in the Chief Justice's office across from Police Chief Brennan. A heavy-set man with gray hair and a permanent frown, Chief Brennan looked genuinely troubled. "Judge Wilson, I want to personally apologize for Officer Redding's behavior," Brennan began. "It was completely unacceptable and doesn't reflect our department's values." Judge Wilson studied the man's face. "With all due respect, Chief, I think it does reflect your department's values. Officer Redding didn't make up the idea that a black man in an expensive car must have stolen it. He learned that somewhere." Chief Brennan shifted uncomfortably. "Officer Redding has been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation." "Administrative leave," Judge Wilson repeated. "With pay, I assume." The chief didn't answer directly. "We take these matters very seriously." "So do I," Judge Wilson said, "which is why I've decided to file a formal complaint. Not just against Officer Redding, but against your department for allowing this kind of profiling to continue." Chief Justice Reynolds leaned forward. "Wilson, perhaps we should discuss this privately first." "With respect, Your Honor, I've made up my mind," Judge Wilson replied firmly. "I've spent 15 years telling people to trust the system. Now I need to see if the system actually works." As they were speaking, the door opened and a young aide rushed in. "Sorry to interrupt, but you all need to see this." She turned on the TV mounted on the wall. A press conference was already in progress. Officer Redding stood at a podium, flanked by his union representative. "I was simply following protocol," Redding was saying. "The vehicle matched a description we were given. At no point did I treat Judge Wilson differently than any other suspect." "That's a lie," Judge Wilson said quietly. There was no stolen vehicle report. The union rep took over the microphone. "Officer Redding is a decorated police officer with 12 years of exemplary service. This attempt to smear his reputation by claiming racial bias is unfounded and offensive." Chief Brennan's face darkened. "I didn't authorize this press conference." On screen, a reporter asked, "Officer Redding, would you have treated a white judge the same way?" "I don't see color when I'm doing my job," Redding replied stiffly. "I see potential threats and suspicious behavior." Judge Wilson turned to Chief Brennan. "He just called me a potential threat for driving my own car." Chief Justice Reynolds muted the TV. "This is getting out of hand. Wilson, what do you want to come from this?" Judge Wilson thought about his children watching their father being humiliated on the evening news. He thought about every black parent having the talk with their kids about how to survive police encounters. He thought about his position, his power, his responsibility. "I want change," he said simply. "Real change, and I think I know how to make it happen." The courthouse steps were packed with reporters and cameras. Judge Wilson stood at the microphone, his wife beside him, his lawyer slightly behind. He'd worn his regular suit today, not his robes. This wasn't about his position, it was about his humanity. "3 nights ago, I was pulled over 3 blocks from my home," he began, his voice steady. "I was driving my own car. I had broken no laws. Yet I was forced to stand in the street, hands on my vehicle, while being searched in front of my neighbors. Why? The officer claimed my car matched the description of a stolen vehicle." He paused, looking directly into the cameras. "There was no stolen vehicle report matching my car that day. None. When another officer recognized me as a judge, suddenly the situation changed. But I have to ask myself, what if I hadn't been a judge? What if I had been just another black man driving a nice car in a nice neighborhood? Would I have ended up in handcuffs, or worse?" The crowd was silent, hanging on his every word. "I've spent 15 years on the bench, telling people to respect the law, to trust the system. Today, I'm putting that same system to the test." His lawyer stepped forward, explaining that they had filed a formal complaint against Officer Redding and the police department, but that wasn't all. Judge Wilson has also proposed a new community oversight program, the lawyer explained. A civilian review board with real power to examine cases of potential racial bias in policing. As the questions began, Judge Wilson noticed a familiar face at the back of the crowd. Officer Rivera, in civilian clothes, watching silently. That evening, Judge Wilson sat in his home office, scrolling through the flood of messages. Some were supportive. Others were not. People he'd known for years questioning why he was making such a big deal out of it. Strangers calling him far worse. His son knocked on the doorframe. "Dad, you okay?" Judge Wilson motioned him in. "Just reading some interesting perspectives on what happened." His son glanced at the screen. "They're calling you names. Why are you even reading that stuff?" "Because it matters what people think," Judge Wilson replied. "Change doesn't happen unless people's minds change first." The doorbell rang. Through the window, he could see a police cruiser parked outside. "Stay here," he told his son, tension creeping into his voice. At the front door stood Officer Rivera, still in uniform. "Your Honor," Rivera said, looking nervous. "May I speak with you?" Judge Wilson hesitated, then stepped outside, closing the door behind him. "What can I do for you, officer?" "I gave my statement today," Rivera said, "about what happened that night. I told them the truth, that there was no stolen vehicle report for a Mercedes. That Officer Redding had no cause to stop you." Judge Wilson studied the young officer's face. "That couldn't have been easy." Rivera looked down. "No, sir, it wasn't. The other officers, they're not happy with me." "Crossing that blue line comes with a cost," Judge Wilson acknowledged. "It's worth it," Rivera said firmly. "What happened to you was wrong, and it's not the first time I've seen it happen." Judge Wilson wasn't surprised. "Tell me more." "There's a group of us," Rivera continued, lowering his voice. "Younger officers mostly. We see what's happening. We want things to change, but we don't know how to make it happen from the inside." Judge Wilson felt a glimmer of hope for the first time in days. Maybe we can help each other. When Rivera left, Judge Wilson's wife was waiting in the kitchen. "What did he want?" she asked, concern in her eyes. "To do the right thing," Judge Wilson replied. "And apparently he's not alone." She looked skeptical. "Can you trust him?" "I don't know yet," he admitted. "But this might be the opportunity we've been waiting for. Change doesn't just come from the outside pushing in. Sometimes it needs people on the inside pushing out." His phone buzzed with a text from Chief Justice Reynolds. "Police chief wants to meet again. Says they have a proposal. What are you thinking?" Judge Wilson smiled slightly. "I'm thinking we might actually have a chance to fix something broken." His wife squeezed his hand. "Just be careful. Some things break harder when you try to fix them." The community center was packed to capacity. People stood along the walls, sat in the aisles, and crowded around the doorways. Judge Wilson had expected maybe 50 people to show up for this town hall meeting. Instead, there must have been 300. At the front of the room, a long table had been set up with microphones. Judge Wilson sat in the center. To his right sat Chief Justice Reynolds and 2 community leaders. To his left sat Police Chief Brennan and, surprisingly, Officer Redding himself. The officer looked uncomfortable in his civilian clothes, his eyes darting around the room as though searching for escape routes. It had been his lawyer's idea for him to attend, a show of good faith, an attempt to humanize himself before the lawsuit proceeded. Judge Wilson tapped his microphone. "Thank you all for coming tonight. This isn't a trial. It's not about pointing fingers or placing blame. It's about having an honest conversation about what happened to me and what happens to many people who don't have the protection of a judge's title." A murmur ran through the crowd. Chief Brennan leaned forward to speak. "The police department acknowledges that mistakes were made during Judge Wilson's traffic stop," he said carefully. "We are committed to reviewing our procedures and training to ensure this type of incident doesn't happen again." Someone in the audience called out, "That's what you said last time." Judge Wilson raised his hand for quiet. "Let's remain respectful. Everyone will have a chance to speak." For the next hour, community members shared their stories. A college professor described being followed around stores by security guards. A doctor told of being pulled over 3 times in 1 month, driving to night shifts at the hospital. A teenager explained how he'd learned to keep his hands visible at all times when interacting with police. Officer Redding sat stiffly through it all, his expression unreadable. When it was his turn to speak, he cleared his throat nervously. "I followed protocol as I understood it," he began, his voice defensive. "The vehicle matched general characteristics of—" There was no stolen vehicle report. Judge Wilson interrupted gently. "Officer Rivera confirmed that." Redding's face flushed. "I received information over the radio about suspicious vehicles in the area." "Can you define suspicious?" Judge Wilson asked. The officer shifted in his seat. "Vehicles that seem out of place in certain neighborhoods. Like a black man driving a Mercedes in an upscale area?" The room went silent. Redding looked down at his hands. "I don't make the rules," he said finally. "I just enforce them." "But that's just it," Judge Wilson replied. "You do make rules every day, with every decision about who looks suspicious and who doesn't, who gets a warning and who gets handcuffed, who seems out of place and who belongs." From the back of the room, a new voice spoke up. It was Officer Rivera. "He's right," Rivera said, standing. "We're trained to look for suspicious behavior, but what does that actually mean? Too often, it just means someone who doesn't look like they belong in a neighborhood based on how they look." Several other officers in the crowd, all in civilian clothes, nodded in agreement. Chief Brennan looked startled. "Officer Rivera, this isn't the appropriate forum." "Actually," Judge Wilson cut in, "this is exactly the right forum. We need honest voices from inside the department if anything is going to change." A young woman in the front row raised her hand. "So what happens now?" "We've had these conversations before. Nothing changes." Judge Wilson leaned forward. "Something already has changed. The police department has agreed to implement body cameras for all officers within 30 days. They've agreed to release stop data broken down by race and neighborhood every quarter. And they've agreed to my proposal for a civilian oversight board with real power." He glanced at Officer Redding, who still wouldn't meet his eye. "And as for Officer Redding and me," Judge Wilson continued, "we've agreed to something unusual. Starting next month, we'll be leading a series of joint trainings for both new officers and judges. He'll share his perspective from law enforcement, and I'll share mine from the bench. And as someone who experienced profiling firsthand." Redding finally looked up, surprise evident on his face. This hadn't been part of what his lawyer had negotiated. "Why would you want to work with me?" he asked quietly, leaning toward Judge Wilson so only those at the table could hear. "Because," Judge Wilson replied, "lasting change doesn't come from pushing people away. It comes from bringing them in, uncomfortable as that might be for both of us." 6 months had passed since that night Judge Wilson stood with his hands on his Mercedes while his neighbors watched. 6 months of meetings, arguments, setbacks, and small victories. And now, here he was, standing before 20 new police academy recruits, with Officer Redding beside him. "This is the car," Judge Wilson said, gesturing to his Mercedes parked in the academy lot. "The one Officer Redding was convinced I stole." The recruits shifted uncomfortably, glancing between the judge and the officer. They'd all seen the video by now. It had become required viewing at the academy. "Tell them what you saw that night," Judge Wilson said to Officer Redding. Redding cleared his throat. These sessions hadn't gotten any easier for him over the months. "I saw an expensive car in a neighborhood where I didn't think it belonged," he admitted. "And when I saw who was driving it, I made assumptions. And those assumptions nearly destroyed 2 careers," Judge Wilson added. "Mine and yours." The lawsuit had been settled. The police department had implemented the promised reforms: body cameras, data collection, the civilian oversight board. But this program, bringing Officer Redding and Judge Wilson together to train new officers, had been the most controversial part. "I didn't want to do this at first," Redding told the recruits. "I thought Judge Wilson was just out to humiliate me, to make an example of me. But that wasn't it at all." A young recruit raised her hand. "Sir, how do you work with someone who profiled you like that? How do you get past it?" Judge Wilson looked at Redding, then back at the recruit. "I didn't say I've gotten past it. Some days I still get angry thinking about it, but this isn't about my feelings or Officer Redding's. It's about making sure what happened to me doesn't happen to someone else, someone who might not have a judge's robe to protect them." After the training, Judge Wilson found Officer Rivera waiting by his car. "How'd it go today?" Rivera asked. As one of the leaders of the reform-minded officers, he'd been instrumental in making these changes happen from inside the department. Better, Judge Wilson replied. Redding actually admitted his bias without being prompted this time. That's progress, Rivera nodded. The new recruits really listen to you two together. It's powerful. Judge Wilson unlocked his car. Any pushback on the new traffic stop protocols? Some of the older officers are still grumbling, Rivera admitted. But the data speaks for itself. Stops are down, but actual arrests for serious crimes are up. Turns out when you're not wasting time pulling over people who look suspicious, you catch more real criminals. Driving home, Judge Wilson thought about how far they'd come and how far they still had to go. His phone rang through the car's speaker system. Just checking if you're still coming to dinner, his wife said. Everyone's here waiting. On my way, he replied. How are they doing? Judge Patel brought wine. Chief Justice Reynolds is arguing with your brother about basketball, and your daughter is showing everyone her college acceptance letters, again. Judge Wilson smiled. Tell them I'll be there in 10 minutes. As he turned onto his street, he noticed a police cruiser behind him and felt a familiar tightness in his chest, a reflex that might never fully disappear. But the cruiser drove past without stopping. He pulled into his driveway where several cars were already parked. From inside, he could hear laughter and conversation, his family, his colleagues, his community. As he stepped out of his Mercedes, he remembered standing in almost this exact spot 6 months ago, hands shaking, dignity wounded, trying to explain to his children why their father had been treated like a criminal. His front door opened and his son stepped out. Dad, you're late. Did you get pulled over again? He grinned, able to joke about it now. Very funny, Judge Wilson replied, putting his arm around his son's shoulders. You know, your sister's showing off those acceptance letters again. Yeah, she won't shut up about it, his son laughed. As they walked toward the house, a neighbor waved from across the street, Mrs. Chen, who had spoken up that night to identify him as a judge. Evening, Your Honor, she called. Good evening, he called back, raising his hand in greeting. It was just a simple exchange between neighbors, but to Judge Wilson it represented something profound. 6 months ago, he'd been a stranger on his own street, someone who didn't belong. Now he was just a neighbor coming home. Not because he wore a judge's robe. Not because he drove an expensive car. But simply because he was human, and this was where he belonged.